let's get started with the program. We're going to divide the program up into three parts. We're going to start out with Bennett Greenspan talking about the technology and the impact on genealogy. And then we're going to have, after we finish with that, but I think that it would help to have a grounding and a basis of understanding the technology, what is going on, how things have advanced. Russ Capper is going to then come up and interview Bennett and talk about the experience of starting up the first commercial DNA testing company for genealogy. And it's really quite a story. It's one of Russ's favorite stories of all the businesses that have been here in Houston. And a lot of people don't realize that it happened here in Houston. It didn't happen in Silicon Valley.
Thank you.
It happened here in Houston. And I think that that is just a marvelous story. And then we're going to finish up with question and answers from the audience. And that gives you a chance to ask questions that, as you go through the lecture, that I'm sure there's going to be plenty of questions that are going to come up. All right. I'd now like to introduce Bennett Greenspan. Bennett is actually from Nebraska. He's a Nebraskan. He went to the University of Texas, got a BA there, and has lived in Texas. He's an entrepreneur and a lifelong genealogy enthusiast. And what happened is his enthusiasm for genealogy had transitioned into becoming a company. And I think it's just a fantastic story about when people have a passion for something, how they can make things happen. After selling his photography business back in the late 1990s, or a year actually after he sold his photographic company, Bennett started Family Tree DNA in 2000. So it's been in existence for about 15 years, but he was the first one to be doing it in 2000. His effort and innovation created the burgeoning field now known as genetic genealogy. And so Houston's on the map because of that. It's a real pleasure for me to have this story here for part of our program. Family Tree DNA has cooperated with a number of other organizations, National Geographic, the African DNA.com organization, to do DNA testing around the world. They have combined to have the largest collection of, I think, DNA testing that's non-medical in the world. And so what they've done in mapping things out and really starting this business is really amazing. So please welcome Bennett Greenspan.
Thank you, David.
Yep. Let's get you hooked up here.
Good evening. So what do we have here? Okay. So as you've heard, I've been a genealogist since I was a boy. When my grandmother died, I was 12, and we went to the cemetery. My dad took my hand after the burial, and we walked around the cemetery. My mom took my brother's hand, walked around the cemetery. And even though I grew up in Omaha, Nebraska with one grandmother, no first cousins, no aunts, no uncles, essentially living in the city, I found out that day that I had lots of relatives in Omaha, Nebraska. They were all conveniently in the same place. They were lined up next to each other, just waiting for me to come and meet them. They were all in the cemetery. So at 12, I became interested in genealogy, but I've also been interested in business. At 13, I was sent to the principal's office at my junior high school for the first time because I had been, shall we say, pirating packages of gum into the school, like 15, 20 packs a day, and there was a good profit in that. And so, perhaps it's not surprising that 20 or 25, 30 years later, that I put the two of them together, and I've actually made a business out of what was really a lifelong hobby. So let's see if I can move this forward. Okay. So We've been doing DNA testing for about 15 years. It started out very, very quietly, very, very slowly. People didn't want to talk to me. When we went to trade shows, no one would come in my booth. I would step outside of my booth and I would extend my hand, and once I had my hand firmly grasping another person's hand, I would walk backwards, walk them into the booth, and ask them if they'd like to understand how DNA testing might help their own genealogy. Most people were very skeptical. The most skeptical were the professional genealogists, because in theory they felt they had something to lose. I presented the technology as nothing more than another tool in the toolkit of the prepared genealogist. And eventually the genealogical community understood that. It took a little bit longer for the professionals to understand that. But I'm happy to tell you now that those professionals who did not subscribe to this new technology, they've either retired or they're in the same place that all my great-great-grandparents are. And the new generation of people who are interested in genealogy consider DNA testing now to be a first-line product, which means they consider it to be something that you should do first. I was a little embarrassed when my customers started saying, oh, just do a DNA test and don't bother with your genealogy. And these are hardcore genealogists who are saying this. I kind of, as I said, I was a little embarrassed by their exuberance and by their enthusiasm until they eventually sat me down and explained to me they reminded me that we genealogists can spend a lot of time and we can waste a lot of time. We can get nowhere fast, or we can do a DNA test and know that we are related to someone, and then the question is, how do you connect the dots rather than wasting a lot of time trying to prove that your Smiths are related to these Smiths when actually they're not. So the first DNA test that was done in 1997 was done by a fellow named Michael Hammer from the University of Arizona. He did a study on what are called the Kohanim. These guys are, in theory, descendants of Aaron, the brother of Moses. That was kind of interesting to a certain niche of the population, but in 1998, a fellow named Mark Jobling from University of Leicester in England decided that he was going to do us Americans a favor, and he was going to answer that perennial question: did Thomas Jefferson get his deceased wife's half-sister pregnant once or many times, siring children with them? And so he reached out to the Jefferson Society in America, was able to obtain DNA samples from those folks, and then he reached out and also obtained DNA samples from the descendants of Easton Hemmings, who have the oral tradition of being descended from Jefferson. He also picked up samples from the Woodson family because they were in the area at the time. And when they did their DNA test, they came out with some interesting results. Now, let me just say, before I get to that point, that in 1826, when President Jefferson died, there were immediately newspaper articles that said he had sired a child with Sally Hemings. On the 50th anniversary of his death in July of 1876, those same newspaper articles came out. And so that was really the backdrop for Professor Jobling to try to decide that he was going to solve this puzzle for us Americans. So he did his DNA test, and the results were actually quite interesting. What it did is it totally excluded the Woodson family and very, very clearly pointed to a Jefferson male. I didn't say Thomas Jefferson, and I cannot say Thomas Jefferson. I can say a Jefferson male, and that's because paternity tests can tell you if this child is the child of the father, but a standard Y-DNA test that looks at the direct male line is not able to do that. And therefore, it could have been Thomas Jefferson. Let's see, Thomas is here. Could have, in theory, been his Uncle Field, or it could have been either of his two first cousins. So to really be able to say that Thomas Jefferson was with Sally Hemings, you would really need to look at that man's schedule. You'd need to find where he was and where she was 9 months before the child was born to absolutely be able to answer the question. But of course, most elements of the press didn't care about that because they saw an article that had everything that America likes. It had race, it had sex, it had politics, and this was like a made for, today's television or then's newspapers story. And so that's what the headlines said. If you dug behind the headlines, certainly all the academics said it could have been Thomas Jefferson, could have been any other male Jefferson, but it clearly was not the other presumed men who were in the neighborhood at the time. My goals when I started this company, or prior to when I started this company, were much simpler. I had done some genealogy in 1999 when I'm interviewed by Russ later. We'll get into the particulars of that. But essentially, I went to my genealogy because I was unemployed at the time. I started doing some research on the one line of my family that I had never done any genealogical work on. And I reached out to all the cousins. I took down their names, took down their addresses, put their genealogical information into a computer program, and I was very happy when I was completed. I went to Kinko's and I printed out a nice 11 by 17 that showed all the relatives, and I sent it to them. And that was very nice. Then I entered that name into a database, and I found someone searching for people with the same last name as my mother's father, but they lived in Buenos Aires. And so the question was, how could our family have traveled 5,000 miles to the United States from Eastern Europe, and they traveled the same distance and went to South America? We knew nothing about them. So any genealogist will tell you the same thing that any good reporter will tell you, which is I need a couple of sources. One source is not enough. I need more evidence. And we had naming conventions in common. They claimed to have known that they had relatives in the United States. We had no such oral tradition in our family. And let's see. I see we've got a little gremlin here. Okay, so all I wanted to do was to find if these folks were related. And that sounds simple, but in 1999, that opportunity didn't exist. What I did is I had this idea one night, late on a Saturday night in Houston, Texas, while I was walking my dog about 1 in the morning, and the next morning I got up and I looked for those papers, the two papers, the Jobling paper and the Kohanim paper, and I found that there was one American who had been a lead author on one of those two studies, and so I called him at his home in Arizona, brazenly on a Sunday morning. His wife answered the phone and said, look, he's really busy. He's on his way to speak at a conference. And I said, that's fine. I won't take long. And I'm a salesman, folks, so I choreograph every sales call, and this was nothing more than a sales call. He came on the phone and I introduced myself and said, look, will you do a DNA test on my cousin in California and these folks in Argentina? And he said, no, we only do that for academic studies. And I said, that's fine. Where can I go? Because all I want to do is buy a DNA test, because really all I want to do is prove that those folks in Argentina are related to us. And he said, I don't think anyone is doing this kind of DNA testing anywhere in the world. And so I didn't have a third question choreographed. So I hem-hawed around a little bit, and I mumbled something to the effect that it sure would be nice if the university would give back to us little people, since we're the ones that ultimately pay the taxes, but not being an Arizonan, he didn't think too much of that. He then said to me something very interesting. He said, someone should start a company like this, because I get phone calls from crazy genealogists like you all the time. at which point I rushed him off the phone, told him I knew he was busy, told him that I was going to write a business plan and send it to him in a couple of days. He said, take your time, I'll be in Spain speaking for a week. And so that's really the beginning in late 1999 of this genesis. Now, having got off the phone with the professor, I went to my wife and I said, I know what I'm going to do next. And she said, what are you going to do? And I said, I'm going to sell DNA tests to genealogists all over the country. And she looked at me and she kind of rolled her eyes a little bit. And I realized that what she was referring to is that I was soft on the sciences in school. and so I decided I better learn about these 23 pairs of chromosomes that we have. And so in effect, for those who don't have a strong biology background, if you can see, this pointer's not real good, but the chromosomes are numbered from 1 to 23. You can see that up on the screen. The first 22 pairs of chromosomes are what we call recombinant. What they do is you get half, in effect, from mom, and you get half from dad, and they recombine. Well, the Y chromosome, down in the corner there, that small, demure chunk of DNA that makes men men, doesn't have anything to recombine with. So that acts as a perfect tracking device to allow us to look at a man's father's line, both genealogically and anthropologically. So when I look at my DNA, I can find in our database who I match within the last several generations, but I can take my Y chromosome line back thousands of years to the places we lived after we left Africa, and because I'm a Homo sapien like everyone else, we all come from Africa. And if y'all haven't heard that or weren't taught that in 5th or 6th grade, natural science, and I was not taught that in natural sciences in 5th or 6th grade, I can tell you that all those teachers were wrong. And in the 1980s, it was pretty well recognized by the academics of the world that there's one race, the human race. There were not 3 arisings of Homo sapien. So we all descend from that first Homo sapien genetic Adam in Africa and that first genetic Eve, who, not surprisingly, happened to be in the same place. Now, within the cell, in the center of the cell, we have all that nuclear DNA, which is that recombinant DNA plus the X and the Y chromosome. Outside of the cell, we have what's called mitochondria. Mitochondria has like a symbiotic relationship with the cell in that it provides energy to the cell and it gains nourishment from the cell. The mitochondria is passed on from a woman to all of her children, and then the daughters pass that on to the next generation. So, for example, my wife's mitochondria was passed to my 2 children. My son and my daughter have identical mitochondria. On the other hand, it's my daughter's job to pass on that mitochondria. Since my wife's sister didn't have any kids, if that mtDNA is going to get passed on, it all rides upon my daughter. On the other hand, I have a brother, okay, and he had a couple of daughters. Didn't have any sons. Consequently, it's all on my son's shoulders to pass down my Y chromosome. And my father was an only son, and my grandfather was an only son. So if that Y chromosome is going to be passed down, I did my job. They need to do their job. So what types of DNA testing are available? I'm going to talk about 2 right now, the 2 that I've just talked about. The Y DNA test, which is for males only. It's used genealogically and anthropologically. Mitochondria is in both men and women. So any man here who wants to look at his mother's line, let's say that you are told on your mom's direct female line that you descend from a Native American princess. So if that happened to be the case, your female DNA would be typical of Native Americans. And if either a man or a woman wanted to interrogate that, they would use a mitochondria test. Now, what can you determine by taking a DNA test? And by the way, none of these things were available to genealogists, nor was the concept available to genealogists in the year 2000. And as I said, we presented this idea to say that we were met by so to speak, that industry with a warm handshake would be an overstatement, unless there was ice on the inside of their palm. What you can do is you can find family relationships. You can determine the possible times to the most recent common ancestor, and I'll demonstrate that in a moment. You can find out where your ancestors came from, and you can determine the branch of the tree of mankind that you descend from. All of those things we'll be talking a little bit more about shortly. So I get asked a lot, who should take a DNA test? And I have a few simple answers. Anyone who's got a missing link in your family, anyone who's trying to prove or disprove a rumor, those who do not have a fear of Big Brother, and that's very important because, you know, we're all concerned about privacy and confidentiality, and genealogists or anyone else who understand that your personal history is written into your DNA, and the good news is that now at the beginning of the 21st century, we're learning how to read that book. Traditional genealogy would, for example, say, am I related, and I'm the guy on the left, am I related to this guy? This guy happens to be Alan Greenspan, and if I've been asked, you know, only once tonight, it's surprising, but typically I get asked, you know, every week, wherever I am, are you related to Alan Greenspan? Are you related to Alan Greenspan? Well, the sad story here is that when I asked Alan Greenspan if he would do a DNA test, he just about literally said, I'm surprised that I thought you'd want my autograph. And I said, well, I really don't want your autograph. I really want your DNA signature. And so he said to me, well, what does it matter? And again, I like to plan conversations that I'm going to have, but I really didn't expect that answer from him. And so I looked at him right in the eye and said, well, you might find out you're related to me. Well, that didn't go over so well. In other words, it didn't get him to open his mouth and say, sure, I'd love for you to scrape the inside of my cheek. And so maybe you see some family resemblance, maybe you don't see some family resemblance. I have tested 68 men from around the world, all with my same last name, and the only men I match are my dad, my brother, and my son. Now, admittedly, that's great news either for the guys or for the women in our family. However, it has eluded me to find other relatives who came to the United States, and at this point, I don't even believe that the name was Greenspan. I think that the guy in front of my great-great-grandfather was named Greenspan, and I think he said my name is the same thing. Because I have tested men who come from all over Europe, living in the United States, living in Denmark, living in South Africa, living in Australia, all parts of the United States, and I have found absolutely no one who's related to me so far. So let's talk a little bit about those mutations. Mutations are nothing more than copying errors. You may have seen a copying machine that when it gets old, the O's get pinched at the top and the bottom, or you can have an E that's lost so much of it that you could confuse it for a C. Well, if someone were to write down a C instead of an E, that is a manuscript copying error. In effect, the Y chromosome, or your DNA, does the same thing. There are copying errors that are passed from generation to generation. Most of the time, they're benign. They're of no significance. If they happen to be within a gene that should be coding for a protein, it can be a very, very severe outcome. But on the genealogical side, what we're doing is we're looking for those copy errors to try to determine who is most closely related to whom. So what I have here is I have these three people, and this man, or this person, are all what's expressed down here. You see, this man has a mutation, and he passed on that exact mutation to his son. That would be this man and this man. This This fellow had a couple of kids. He didn't get a mutation from his father. He passed his DNA on to one of his sons, intact, identical, and one of them yet got another mutation. That additional mutation would be here, and the son who is no different at all from his father is the top person here. So upon seeing these results, my brother had a smile on his face, and he's an actuary, which means that he rarely has a smile on his face. And he said, you know what? I now know what you are. You're the mutant in our family. I took that fairly well. So the question might be, how do you know from these copying errors how distantly we might be related to another person? That's a very legitimate question. So in conjunction with our customer base, their genealogies and their DNA tests, and the University of Arizona, we did a mutation rate study. And we were able to determine the mutation rate for dozens of Y short tandem repeat markers that we look at on the Y chromosome. From that, we're able to make a calculator, which in effect tells people that the likelihood that you share a common ancestor with this individual in X number of years is X percentage, or is Y percentage. And so that's what this demonstrates here. This demonstrates that I and this guy named Marvin Zaloff, who I've never heard of, our DNA is close enough that there's about a 95% chance that he and I actually shared a common male ancestor within the last 200 years, or really 200 years prior to our birth. So taking it back to about 1750, that fellow and I are almost certainly sharing a common great-great-great-great-great-grandfather. People also want to know, who am I related to? In this particular case, you can see perhaps in the upper left-hand corner it says LBJ1. What I have been doing for many years is I've been collecting DNA from our presidents. So whenever I find someone who's a descendant of a president or knows the descendant of a president, I always, beseech them to get that individual to do a DNA test. And we were trying to confirm the DNA signature of President Lyndon Johnson. So we found through our Johnson surname project some people who live in a place called London, Texas, which is where this fellow is from. Let's see here. Okay, which is where that particular fellow is from. Let's go back. And he matches another fellow whose common ancestor is one generation above Lyndon Johnson. So what we can presume is that these guys would have been cousins with Lyndon Johnson. Their grandfathers, or actually their great-grandfathers, and Lyndon's father were brothers. So we have a reasonably strong confidence level that unless there was a non-paternal event, we now know the DNA signature of Lyndon Johnson. And so if you look at all the names, every single person on this list is named Johnson except for one, which happens to be an individual whose name is Grimes, and I would submit to you that that is probably an unannounced adoption, or an announced adoption, or a false paternity. False paternity means there was some infidelity, for those of you that didn't get that politically correct description. What we do is we allow people to list their oldest known ancestor, and so if you happen to know your oldest known ancestor, you can enter it into the system, and then anyone can in effect share that kind of information. Even President or former President Jimmy Carter has played in this game. I was speaking once in Atlanta. I mentioned my presidential project. Someone came up to me, told me he worked at the library and that one of the president's sons was very interested in genealogy and thought for sure that he could obtain that DNA sample. And if you look here, you'll see Carter, 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 Carter. You see all these men named Carter. Their oldest common ancestor is a fellow named Thomas Carter, who was born in 1650, and certainly President Jimmy Carter descends from that same lineage. Lots of people want to know where they came from, because most of us have been in this country. The good old country might have not been such a good old country. Consequently, we voted with our feet and we came somewhere else. This particular individual, who I will reveal later, has DNA matches to 43 people in Ireland and he has exact matches to 43 people in Ireland, and he has nearly exact matches to 200 people in Ireland as well. So based on this, we would get a very, very strong idea that this fellow's ancestors are from Ireland. Now, whether they were from Ireland and were kicked out of Scotland by the British because they lived in the Borders Reivers area, that we don't know, although with enough study, the databases are now big enough that you can actually determine that fact as well. Now, I mentioned earlier these branches of the tree of mankind. In effect, this tree didn't exist in 2000, and certainly the genetic genealogists didn't care about it in the year 2000. They only wanted to know if their Carter was related to this Carter, or my nits was related to the South American nits. But eventually, over time, the anthropologists started building a phylogeny, which is a theoretical construct of how evolution has taken place within any species. So rats have a phylogeny, and rice has a phylogeny, and Homo sapien has a phylogeny. You can see that I've listed up here genetic Adam. So this is the first man that all of us men in this room are descended from. Now, the interesting thing about this phylogeny is that there is geographical specificity within the chart, which means that if you're an A or a B, most A's and B's in the world are from sub-Saharan South and Southeastern Africa. Every man in the world that we have ever tested we've been able to place on this chart. What that means is, for those of you that go, oh, he's such a Neanderthal. You can say that about your wife's brother or whomever, but really he's probably not a Neanderthal. He might have a little bit of Neanderthal DNA, interestingly, because all of us seem to have a little bit of Neanderthal DNA. It comes from a time when we probably had some relations with them 20, 30, 40,000 years ago. But every single man that we have ever tested, we can place somewhere on this tree. Now, what's interesting is that haplogroup D is found in the mountains of Tibet and Japan. E is found in North Africa, and another branch is found in sub-Saharan Africa. C must have marched along with D because the C population dominates in China. If you look at G, that's from the Caucasus Mountains. H is from India. I was the first branch of the tree of mankind to enter Europe about 30,000 years ago, and they're spread out all over Europe. L is also found in India. M is Micronesia. N is typical of Finland. O is also found in Asia. Q is found in Asia and among Native Americans. About 75% of Native Americans are from that particular branch. The R branch is typical of Central and Western Europe, but it's quite spread out. It came into Europe with the advent of agriculture probably about 8,000 years ago. This T group, which, by the way, Thomas Jefferson was a T. T is most commonly found in northern Lebanon. Some people have speculated that it may have moved up to Wales, which is where Thomas Jefferson is from, might have moved with the Vikings. That's kind of a romantic story that some folks at National Geographic have told. How the Jeffersons got there, we have absolutely no idea, but this branch of the tree called T is found at less than 1/2% of all the people in England. And S is also found in Micronesia. Let's see, there's a migration map. This map shows you how we dispersed out of Africa. Some people moved all the way to Australia. Other people came to the New World much later. And some people forged through the Middle East and then hooked back into Europe. I mentioned I had a presidential DNA project. We've now got about a dozen of our president's lines, we believe, documented, and you can see that almost all of the men hail from, I mean, all their names indicate that they hail from Western Europe. Certainly, most of these guys are from this R1b group, which is typical of Western Europe, although we do have Thomas Jefferson, who's a T. Lyndon Johnson's ancestors 10,000 years ago were probably living in North Africa. Again, how they got to England or Scotland or Ireland, no idea. And then, of course, we know they eventually ended up here. But I think it's very interesting to take a look at these branches of the tree of mankind. What it shows you is that, you know, we're all from the same tree. Even people that we think as homogeneous are not homogeneous, and I'll show you some examples of that in a few minutes. Now I have my visitor's guide information again. Okay, so I had a kind of an interesting email, and this is really typical of the kind of stuff that we typically see. The important thing is that I was in Birmingham, England, a week and a half ago at a genealogy show, and someone was anxiously waiting for the results, so he sent me a nice email that tells me that we have now proved a link that has been a puzzle in their family for 5 decades. And they did that by doing a DNA test. They have a very uncommon name, and they were able to use that to link together names or families that were from a couple of different parts of England. They had oral traditions, and they had an uncommon name. Likely they're related to each other, but that's not good enough for a scientist, and that's not good enough for a genealogist. Here's kind of an interesting one. A fellow wrote us a couple years ago and said, being an avid genealogist, I joined the Hatfield Y-DNA project to locate a common ancestor. However, the results excluded me and indicated a McCoy lineage instead. On questioning my parents and mentioning the McCoy name, they admitted that I was adopted as an infant and that my deceased father was actually a McCoy. This revelation requires me to rethink some of my core concepts, as well as to shelf about half of my genealogical research. This is my family tree DNA kit number, and I have a perfect 37 marker match with at least 5 members of your group. May I join? Now the truth is the name was not Hatfield, and the name was not McCoy, but being one who upholds the importance of privacy and confidentiality, I had to change the name from what it actually was, but this is another one of the actual emails that we received, and we receive emails like this, quite frankly, all the time. Now, while the Y focuses on the male line, mitochondria focuses on the direct female line. So that's your mother's 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 mother. This has been interesting for the genealogical and anthropological community, but it doesn't have nearly the traction that the surname studies and one-name studies have along the line of the male inherited Y chromosome. Here's what the results look like. In effect, the mitochondria is a circular molecule, very, very small, less than 17,000 base pairs. And so what we do is we look at the differences from what's called the Cambridge reference sequence. We don't look at any of the genes that are within the mitochondria. We only look at the differences from the reference, and then we use that to associate people back to a branch of the tree. And there's also some amounts of geographical specificity. So if someone is from a branch called H, which is common in Europe, and they're from H1 or H3, they're probably the folks that hung out in Spain during the last ice age waiting for, you know, the sheet of ice a mile thick to recede, and then their animals went, and of course we were hunter-gatherers at the time, so that means that we followed because that was dinner. So we do this the same way that we perform the Y-DNA test, in that we can take the data, dump it into the database, and see where your matches are from. Genetic genealogy is nothing more than guilt by association. The fact that this particular individual has 4 perfect matches from Finland and nowhere else. She has 17 matches that are near identical from Finland, which is equal to the total number of matches that she has otherwise. And that if we go even further away, she she has 23 matches from Finland and 1 from Norway. Well, at minimum, we know she's Scandinavian on her mother's line, and in fact, this person is Finnish on her mother's line. There's also a migration map, because wherever the animals went, the men went to follow and the women came along. So I guess, if you're going to have kids and you're going to keep it going, then certainly, you need to go in twos. Oh, by the way, I wanted to mention there's been one interesting scientific breakthrough. Women don't have Y chromosomes, guys. And so half the population is living without a Y chromosome. But there have been, I'm told by the folks at the University of Arizona, 2 things that have been kind of well determined that the Y chromosome conveys. And so if you'll allow me, it's the clicker gene and it's the Sunday afternoon sports gene. Beyond those 2 things, it doesn't seem that the Y chromosome provides anything for males essential for life other than the ability, to produce children. And so maybe that'll be just a lesson for all of us as we're holding onto our clickers so tightly. In 2010, technology had moved forward enough so that instead of sequencing very, very short stretches of either the Y chromosome or the mitochondria, a company called Illumina in San Diego had come out with what they called a microarray. On a microarray, you can pack hundreds of thousands of discrete SNP tests. SNP stands for single nucleotide polymorphism. So those potentially damaging mutations could be packed on that chip, or they could just put random population on that chip. Well, we and a couple other companies took those microarrays and we started building blocks of DNA based on a concept called 1/2 identical by descent. And we build these blocks, which may be 10 or 20 or 50 or 100 million base pairs long, knowing that the longer the block you share with someone, the more closely related to them you are. And so with that, we're able to determine aunt, uncle, niece, nephew, half sibling, first cousin, second cousin, third cousin. And if you saw CBS Sunday Morning this weekend, they had a short piece on about a Vietnamese girl who had an American GI dad, was spirited out of Vietnam on Operation Baby Lift in 1975, and she went back to Vietnam looking for her mother. Now, as it turns out, she didn't find her mother. Her mother died of cancer a few years ago, but she found a man who's, in theory, her uncle, and she found a half-brother. And so she did a DNA test on them. We rushed them through our lab, and on camera last Thursday, she opened up the computer, and they had her reaction to seeing that in fact, she had listed on her account an uncle and a half-brother. And so that kind of made all the crying that she had done prior to that portion in the show kind of worth it. For the first 10 years of this industry, the field was dominated by unisex tests, Y chromosome for men and mitochondria for women. Now that autosomal is available, we can, in effect, learn and find people who are related to us, not just from our dad's dad's dad or our mom's mom's mom, but through our father's mother's family, or our father's mother's father, or our mother's father's mother, because they all have DNA that was passed down to us. It's just not visible on the Y chromosome or on the mitochondria. So, what's special about Family Finder? Well, first of all, you can find relatives, not just on the male or female line, you can find relatives on all lines. You can determine the degree of relatedness, as I explained a moment ago. You can find half-siblings. We've done that many, many times. Sometimes it's a surprise. Sometimes it was expected. You can make contact with your relatives because we have a release form that says that if you want to see people that you match, you sign the release form, they get to see your name and email address, you get to see their name and email address, so you can, in effect, reach out and touch someone. This is absolutely the perfect test for any adoptee who's looking to find biological family. I spoke at the American Adoption Congress in Boston as one of their keynotes a couple of weeks ago, and they're very, very much tied into the fact that they want to change legislation, they want records open, they don't want sealed records, but I told them that it didn't matter what the legislators did, because as we build a robust database with hundreds of thousands and millions of people, they're going to find biological cousins, whether the system makes it or the bureaucracy makes it easy for them or not. And this is a gender agnostic test. So a couple of years ago, before we launched this test, I was going to make a speech about it, and I didn't want to reveal to the people at the conference what I was going to talk about, because I figured that loose lips sink ships, and I really didn't want to tip my hand to any of my competitors. And so eventually I broke down and I explained to this program chair what we were doing, and she sent me an email about 10 minutes later, and she said, "I have the perfect marketing theme for your next test." And she said, "Sex doesn't matter anymore." And so some people laugh. I'm sorry that y'all didn't, but it's interesting because we have an annual conference every year in Houston, and the year we brought out this test, we made this T-shirt, and everybody loved it, and no one would wear it. As I said, this is a perfect test for adoptees. I've kind of blanked out the names here. But this shows that this individual has a half-sister and a half-brother. They happen to be on different sides of his family, but clearly this fellow who was an adoptee who had found his biological mother's family eventually used DNA testing to track down the surname of his father's family, and then found people in the appropriate city and offered them one of our autosomal DNA tests. And sure enough, he found family. Now, he had a little challenge because there were 5 brothers, and he could have been descended from any of those 5 brothers. To make it worse, 2 of those brothers owned bars, and and his mother had gone back to work for this one, but when they were busy at this bar, she, went over to the other bar, and so he didn't know which of these 2 men, and it took him a while. Eventually, he was able to figure it out. Here's a letter we got from a fellow. It says, "I thought you might like to know that my dad met his half-sister, Susan, for the first time tonight. I've attached a photo. It never would have happened without your DNA testing." So the interesting thing is this is a comparison between Rusty Oxford and his son and his half-sister. So what we're looking at here is what we call a chromosome browser. In effect, this shows proportionately the size of the chromosomes and where the DNA is matching between any 2 or 3 or up to 5 people. So this man, Rusty, matches this fellow in orange. That's his son, and it's a perfect match based on 1/2 identical by descent. He should be a perfect match. But when Rusty's son got his results, he had this match to a person named Susan. So he asked his dad, since it came out showing that this woman was his aunt, he asked his dad, "Do you have any siblings that I don't know about?" And the dad said, "Not that I know about." So he got his father to do a DNA test. Sure enough, they came back as they came back as siblings. They came back actually as half-siblings. So it appears that they have different mothers, but they had the same father, but neither of them knew that. Certainly the son, who grew up with his dad all of his life, didn't know that his dad had a liaison with a woman who had a child. And so the bottom line is, if you don't want to know the answer to the question, don't ask the question, because you will get an answer. It might be very interesting, might be intellectually stimulating, might be somewhat devastating. And so we always tell people that there's no reason for multiple brothers to do a Y-DNA test. It's kind of like a poor man's paternity test. We had 3 brothers who tested, and one of them didn't match. They tested with our affiliate, the National Geographic Society. National Geographic did not know what to do with these people when they called yelling and screaming, so they turned it over to us. And so we said, why did the three of you do this test? And they said, well, we always referred to so-and-so as, the redheaded stepchild. But what they found is that he really didn't have the same dad that the older two boys did. And so again, if you don't want to know the answer to the question, be very, very careful about the question you ask and where you ask it, because you might get an answer that you really didn't want or didn't expect. Now, another portion of that test is what's called a percentage test, where we're able to compare your DNA to about 25 reference populations from around the world. And in effect, what we do is we tell you what percentage of your DNA has its best fit in any of those different populations. So this fellow, who we looked at earlier, he was the fellow who had the 43 Irish matches and the 200 Irish matches. Well, when we look at him, it turns out that he's got, way up here in England, Ireland, Scotland, that his DNA is really typical, but his DNA is also typical of Western Africa and Southeastern Africa. And so this fellow is a genetic cornucopia, so to speak. He has DNA from a couple different places, and we regularly find people whose DNA, even though they think they know where they're from, they're not 100%, because truly we're all genetic mutts. No one is 100%. And if you haven't guessed by now, it's Henry Louis Gates Jr., the fellow who does the television show Finding Your Roots on PBS, most recently in the press for this Ben Affleck issue, if some of you have read about that. So Skip's been doing these television shows for a number of years. He's been using our DNA testing company and other services for at least the last 5 or 6 years. And all it takes is a swab. There's a right way to test. That's it. You take this little buccal scraper. Oop, I don't want you to miss this, because we're getting to the fun part. You can see this girl, she's scraping the inside of her cheek. We had a fellow contacted us once who said, I'm a cartoonist, and I really can't afford your DNA test, but if you tell me the best story you've ever had about someone scraping, I'll do some cartoons for you. And maybe we'll do it in trade. So we said, sure, why not? Let's see this. He says, well, what's your best story? And I said, the best story I can think of is the medical doctor who scraped the outside of his cheek instead of the inside of his cheek. And so when we talked to the doctor, because we send out 2 swabs, neither of them worked, and so we said, look, you're supposed to scrape, open your mouth, you're supposed to scrape inside. So he was so embarrassed that he said very, very quickly, am I supposed to scrape the inside of the outside of my cheek or the outside of the inside of my cheek? And we said, look, just open your mouth and scrape. But when I told that to the cartoonist, he said, I have the perfect idea for a slide for you. And so you'll just have to tell me. So you can see that the fellow has his, he's calling the doctor, and he's got his instructions right here. He's got his family tree DNA test kit, but he's scraping the wrong cheek. So I have the last of my 2 slides, and then we'll go into the interview. What's interesting about this is that this doesn't look anything like my wife, but arguably it could look like me if I would grow my mustache back. It was drawn in 1997. Now remember, there was no direct-to-consumer DNA testing in 1997. The only DNA testing that had been done at that time was the Kohanim study and the Jefferson study. Some of us had heard about at the OJ trial they used DNA, but really we as the public knew nothing about DNA at that time, and yet this fellow penned out something that I thought was terribly appropriate. Now, my last slide is what you might consider somewhat inappropriate, but if I don't show you something a little bit inappropriate, I might not get any questions at the end, and so I'll risk that. I don't support what this guy is doing, but I think his heart is in the right place, and recognize I'm in the DNA business. So, so accountants want people to, need accountants, and doctors want people to need doctors, and lawyers the same way, and I'm the same way. So I can't totally fault this fellow. I do think that his methods are a little bit unusual, but it's the picture of the guy who says, need money for DNA test, girlfriend might be sister. And so with that, I thank you for your attention. And I look forward to the next part of the show.
Thank you.